The original Metroid released in 1986 and captivated its players by providing a challenging and epic quest. Featuring Samus Aran, a female bounty hunter with a mysterious past, players navigated uncharted terrain on an alien planet in an attempt to destroy the evil that reigned within its depths. As the series evolved, the shortcomings of the original Metroid became more apparent. Most notable was a complete lack of a map. Also, many of the rooms looked exactly alike, which led to a lot of confusion. Even more confusing was that the game did not explain what any of the power-ups did, so players had to guess their function. 18 years later, Nintendo decided that the original Metroid deserved a major overhaul. New bosses, new arenas, new visuals, a whole new identity. This wouldn't just be a simple port with a few new things thrown in either. This was a whole new game, and would be Samus's Zero Mission. It's easily the best looking 2D Metroid game I've played, and it is more colourful than Metroid Fusion and especially more detailed than Super Metroid. While the original Metroid had simple visuals that made each area look the same, Zero Mission has unique areas that are colourful and easy on the eyes. No longer did you have to deal with bland blank spaces with the same coloured background you've seen for the last 19 rooms. Nintendo really went out of their way to make Zero Mission the best looking in the 2D series, and they certainly succeeded. From the fiery lava regions of Norfair to the robotic interface of Torian, each area is as lovingly detailed as the last. Overall, the incredible gameplay, impressive soundtrack and stunning visuals will no doubt leave a good impression on a seasoned Metroid veteran or just a casual player looking for a solid game for their Game Boy Advance. If you've never had the pleasure of playing it, this is one of those games that you owe it to yourself to check out. The Banjo-Kazooie games have always been some of my favourites, and after two unforgettable outings on the Nintendo 64, it was only a matter of time before a version would appear on the Game Boy Advance. Even though Grunty's Revenge had to sacrifice a lot of what made the original so great, Rare managed to take advantage of the GBA's hardware masterfully, and produced an adventure that feels as close as it could to what had come before. In classic Rare style, the gameplay is solid, mainly because the controls transferred over with a surprising amount of ease, considering this viewer to work with. Now, Grunty's Revenge is split up into several levels, with the main objective being that of collecting various things such as puzzle pieces known as jillies that unlock further levels, or lost creatures known as Jinjos that help in locating some of the more harder to reach items. If there is one thing that Grunty's Revenge does capture, it is the presentation and look of its console counterparts. For a GBA game, it looks amazing, and it is done in the same 3D style as the N64 games. The colour may look a little washed out and some sprites are a little lackluster, but for a system that is such a relative lightweight, it holds its own extremely well. The animation is executed perfectly, and overall, Grunty's Revenge looks remarkable for a Game Boy Advance game. If there was one area where the game fell short though, it would have to be with replayability. The entire quest can be completed in about 5 hours depending on how many items you pick up and how good you are at the game. Once you've finished, there just isn't much else to do but to play some of the old minigames you unlock by collecting tokens. It would be nice to have seen a few more levels or perhaps even a multiplayer mode that would have helped the overall value of the game. When it comes down to it though, if you're looking for a neat little platformer on the GBA and have exhausted some of the more obvious choices, then Grunty's Revenge is well worth playing. Sonic Battle has to be one of the most underrated fighting games you'll find on the GBA. It shares much in common with the likes of Power Stone and sees several characters from the Sonic universe coming together to duke it out in an arena. Like many fighting games, it's made up of several modes, with the main attraction being the story, which allows you to unlock extra characters and stages the further you progress. You've also got battle mode, as well as minigames and training that help pad out the playtime in meaningful ways. Now, the combat system is simple and revolves around the use of special moves of one of 3 different types. These are aerial, ground and defend, which you get to assign to your character at the beginning of each fight. For example, Sonic has a long-range attack that fires a sort of tornado at opponents. If this is assigned to aerial, then Sonic must jump or be in the air before it can be used. The same goes for ground and defend respectively. With so many characters and their individual special moves, there's a lot to play around with, so experimenting with each is an absolute must if you're looking to get good at the game. Now, the visuals of Sonic Battle are the real star of the show, with with each fight taking place from an isometric point of view and the camera moving and rotating around the 3D arenas, giving the battles a nice fast-paced feel. Each area is littered with 3D objects which can be used as platforms or a spot to slam enemies into, and whilst each character is represented by a sprite which seems to have been lifted straight out of Sonic Advance 2, I'm not complaining, as they are all intricately detailed and lovingly animated. On the whole, if you're at all fond of Smash Bros or Power Stone, Sonic Battle will instantly appeal to you with its fun and engaging gameplay that's easy to pick up but challenging to master. Mega Man Battle Network was a completely different take on the usual Mega Man formula. Instead of presenting itself as a platformer, it was an action RPG that saw the story centering around a boy known as Lan, who moves to a new town known as Cyber City. Upon arriving, he learns of the legend of two cyber beasts and a mysterious group that are hell-bent on reviving them, so it's now up to Lan and Mega Man to stop them. Now, like its predecessors, the exploration portions of the game are your average RPG fare, where you walk around and talk to NPCs for clues on where to go next. You control Lan in the real world, and if you find a computer that has access to the net or an electronic device with its own cyber world, you can jack in as Mega Man and send him to the cyber world. The digital space is where most of the action takes place and sees you running into fights with a surprisingly large amount of creative enemies. Each encounter revolves around chips which you bring into battle with you, which all have various effects, such as the basic cannon, which damages your opponent, to the spreader, which damages multiple enemies at a time. Finding and utilizing these different chips within the game is the main way to secure your dominance over every enemy, and with so many on offer and all the different effects they bring to the table, you could spend hours on end coming up with different setups. Now visually, Battle Network 6 has some of the best sprite work you'll find on the Game Boy Advance. It's most prominent in battle, with the animation of each move playing out in a stylish way and lighting the screen up with special effects that add a real weight to your actions. This is further bolstered by the incredible character design that not only includes the player's characters but also extends to the enemies as well, especially the bosses, which are all intricately designed both mechanically as well as visually. Advanced Adventure follows Goku's plight to collect all of the Dragon Balls and summon the eternal dragon Shenron. Just like in the anime, he meets a diverse cast of supporting characters along the way, and each are well represented whether you fight them, save them, or just talk to them. Now the game is largely split up into two separate styles of play. The first is that of a side-scrolling platformer that sees you taking on levels that naturally escalate in difficulty the further you progress. The second is a fighting game that springs up throughout the adventure every time you encounter a boss or character of special interest, and it's here that the game is at its best. As you would expect, you've got a generous amount of attacks as well as special moves ripped straight from the show. Each successful hit will wear away you or your opponent's defense meter, and when one of them reaches zero, that fighter will have won the struggle and will get the opportunity to execute an insanely cool looking combo on the other player. When it comes to presentation, Akira Toriyama's artistry is in full swing. Each character and enemy are represented by some of the best sprite work I've seen on the Game Boy Advance, and seeing it in motion is a real sight to behold. Complementing them, there are a series of special effects that help bring each and every action you perform to life, as well as the stages themselves, which are incredibly diverse, with many different locales from the anime making an appearance. The adventure is over rather quickly though, and the lack of levels does sting quite a bit for those looking for a true advanced take on Dragon Ball, but if it was made too long, it probably would have gotten too repetitive. To make up for the short main game length, you've got several game modes, plus a bounty of unlockable characters to use both in and out of the main quest. If you're a fan of Dragon Ball Z and have a Game Boy Advance handy, you absolutely owe it to yourself to give this one a go. Duke Nukem Advance is in many ways a remake of Duke Nukem 3D, the 1996 game that truly catapulted Duke and his one-liners from shareware action games straight into the commercial spotlight. When stacked up against some of the other FPS games on the Game Boy Advance like Nightfire or X and Sever, Duke Nukem is in a class of its own, both in terms of visual quality and speed. The gameplay is extremely action-heavy, with enemies and opponents sprinkled around each corner, so the only pause throughout the course of the game is when you're stuck trying to solve puzzles puzzles like finding keycards. The minute-to-minute gunplay is the most exciting aspect of the game, and with so many weapons available, you're never short on options when it comes to wiping out the opposition. May that be a standard pistol to the more exotic like rocket launchers, or a straight-up kick to the face, Duke has got you covered, along with his cheesy one-liners that also made the cut. While the game's controls are simplified so you don't have to aim up or down, the level design focuses on elevations, trap-triggered rooms, and even a few platform jumping sequences that are presented in between the action. This helps keep the gameplay fresh, and also provides a way to catch those enemies who may not be on your level when you encounter them. The only real disappointing aspect of the game is its longevity. Most people who play it will likely be able to wrap it up in under 5 hours, but it may take longer if you're hoping to find each and every secret that the game has to offer, as well as going for a 100% kill rate. What saves it though is the inclusion of a multiplayer mode, which allows you and a bunch of friends to host a deathmatch for up to 4 players, which is easily one of the best ways to play this. Overall, Duke Nukem Advance is by far one of the best first-person shooters on the Game Boy Advance. The easy pick-up-and-play nature of the experience really helps open the game up to anyone who wants to play it, regardless of their skill level. If you find it on the cheap, this one is well worth adding to your collection. Crazy Taxi began life in the arcades and later found its way to the Sega Dreamcast, where it was met with critical acclaim. As a result, it wasn't long until a series of ports started to pop up, with the Game Boy Advance receiving one of the most ambitious takes on the series. This wasn't some watered-down port when it came to content. It was the exact same game that saw you driving around a city, with the objective being to make as much money as possible from taxi fares. There was actually 2 fully realized cities that the player got to choose from, and you would be ranked on how well and, more importantly, how fun each trip was for the passenger. This wasn't all though, as to go along with the main mode, 9 different minigames were included as well, which served to mix up the gameplay and offer some sort of replayability for those that managed to unlock everything the game offers. Now let's get the bad and blatantly obvious thing out of the way. The frame rate is shocking, but not to the point of the game becoming unplayable, just rather a necessary trade-off to even have the game up and running in the first place. One of the biggest challenges for graphics was recreating the city environment and traffic on the streets, complete with texture map buildings and street surfaces. But the fact that they even achieved it is something that should be commended, regardless of the frame rate. The taxis players drive around the streets are 2D representations, redrawn at several angles to give off the illusion of a 3D object. The effect works really well, with the game even tilting the sprite as it goes up or downhill or turns around a curve to achieve as much realism as they could. Seriously, do not be turned off by the game's performance. If you can look past it, you'll soon notice how accurate the game plays when compared to the originals, and that is nothing short of an absolute triumph on the Game Boy Advance. Crazy Taxi Catch a Ride is definitely a game that deserves a spot in every GBA owner's collection. The Game Boy Advance was no stranger to first-person shooters, with the likes of 007 Nightfire and Duke Nukem Advance, which I mentioned earlier. Players had a ton of choices when looking for the next FPS to jump into, but one of the more graphically impressive games would have to be Ice 9. It sees you filling the role of an elite agent known as Tom Carter, who's tasked with putting a stop to an evil plot to steal a computer virus which has the potential to disrupt every device on the planet. Now, it's not the most original of plots by any means, but there are a couple of things that the game gets right. The first being the gameplay, which is surprisingly deep considering the perceived lack of inputs on the GBA, but somehow Torres worked around these limitations and created an intricate portable FPS that any fan of the genre could get stuck into with ease. The campaign sees you taking on missions that are made up of various objectives, all made easier by the enormous amount of weaponry and gadgets you get your hands on. When it comes to graphics, Ice 9 is a real showcase of what the Game Boy Advance was capable of, especially when in the hands of the right developers. The backbone of the Ice 9 engine is the same 3D raycasting engine that powered the graphically superior Duke Nukem Advance. The same development team added a number of tweaks and additions and polished the engine to a near perfect state. Some things from the old version of the engine remained, such as unavoidable pixelation and the way speech is told in panels, but all of the textures and graphics used reflect upon the realistic setting the game presents. Each gun model, whilst not sharing its real-life name, is easily recognizable thanks to each of them being lovingly crafted within the engine, and the same goes for the enemies, which have their own details such as bulletproof vests, which are easy to make out and add to the level of realism they were trying to achieve. FPS fans will instantly find something to love here. From the stunning visuals to the tight gameplay, it is a game that will not disappoint. Need for Speed is arguably one of the most recognizable racing franchises, with the Underground entry being one of the more prominent games that helped catapult its success. This no doubt prompted EA to conjure up a portable version for the Game Boy Advance, which holds close to the original's formula and pushes the handheld to its absolute limits. As with most racing games, the main attraction is the Championship mode, known as Go Underground. In this mode, you take on races all the while earning money and acquiring new parts for your car that have a noticeable effect on the gameplay. But it's not just all about simply racing around tracks. There's a slew of different types of events that take place as well, such as sprint, drag and drift, which serve to mix up the gameplay and add a bit of variety to the main mode. The GBA version of Underground is quite simply a technical marvel. For sure, it's nowhere near on par with what Black Box pulled off on the PlayStation 2 and GameCube, but what the developers created is something that will definitely impress anyone who's had time with a GBA. The game utilizes Pocketeer's 3D engine that pushes a fair amount of geometry on the handheld whilst holding a smooth and steady frame rate. The game looks incredibly close to an early PlayStation 1 game, albeit with low texture resolutions, which can become a bit of an issue when reaching high speeds and not being able to judge corners correctly, but it does get easier with time. And like I've mentioned, even with all of this going on under the hood, the game never buckles and provides one of the most enjoyable racing experiences on the handheld. If you're on the lookout for your next game to play on the GBA or are fond of the racing genre in general, then Need for Speed Underground would make a solid choice. When it comes to fighting games on the Game Boy Advance, players were absolutely spoiled for choice, with the likes of Street Fighter and Tekken making an appearance. But when it came to the most graphically impressive fighter, one of them is Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. Of course, it's severely downgraded from its home console counterpart, but the basic gameplay remains intact and flows surprisingly well. As the player, you get the choice of several characters who each possess a string of basic moves, as well as individual special attacks. They all differ wildly, so trying out each to find a fighter that suits your style of play is essential. Of course, that's not all, as one of the main mechanics of the game also found its way into this version, and that was the inclusion of separate stances. Each fighter has two of these that represent a different style of martial art, which adds a considerable amount of depth to the game. Now, the Game Boy Advance wasn't a 3D system by any means, so the developers built every character by using pre-rendered sprites with several frames of animation for each. This was half the battle though, as in order to simulate a 3D environment for each stage, the engine took advantage of the handheld scaling and rotating abilities to provide a seamless set of arenas for each fight to play out in. As a result, the camera slowly zooms in and out and around the action, which ends up simulating a 3D effect and giving the game its almost impossible look. It might seem crude by today's standard, but seeing this up and running in the palm of your hands when it first released was a huge deal. If it wasn't for Street Fighter Alpha 3, Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance would easily be the best fighter on the system. So if you're a fan of the genre, this is one game I can highly recommend you check out. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 4, as that'll be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos. You can follow me on all of the socials, which are linked below, to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skill Jim, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Paul, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.